such a great story all on its own, but one of the things that's so impressive, both about my mother and about my father. So they met at Syracuse, as I said. My mother realized very quickly, she actually didn't want to have a meal with him. She rented his sister's apartment. So my mother, this white woman who leaves West Texas, who had never been out of West Texas, out of the West, had never been in black community, but completely understood racism in America in a very deep personal way because she grew up in it and rejected it, gets on a plane from Abilene, Texas, and goes straight to Harlem, to Union Theological Seminary, and moves straight to the black community. I mean, without skipping a beat. I mean, no transition, no. And everywhere she moved to the black community. So when she goes to, she does 2 years at Union Theological Seminary on a fellowship, finishes the 2-year fellowship, and then she goes to, I forgot why she went to Syracuse, but she decides to go to Syracuse for another 2 years of graduate work in literature. And goes straight to the black community, which meant she rented my father's sister's apartment from her, because my father's older sister was finishing her degree at Syracuse. So my father gets there, and his sister had given him a list of names of people to look up so he could start to get to know people. And of course, there were very few black people at Syracuse, either as students or on faculty. And she gave him, my mother was one of the names on the list. And my mother did not like my father's sister. She could be a little overbearing. And she didn't want to meet him because she just assumed he was like her. She finally agrees to have lunch with him and immediately decides he's the finest man she's ever met. And it's very clear after their lunch that they're going to see each other again. And within, like, the way my mother describes it, it wasn't even 2 weeks. He really puts to her, we're not going to continue to do this unless you can marry a black man. Because there's no room for dating, right? It's 1960, 1961, and the North is as racist as the South. It's just a little more gentle in its expression. Syracuse is highly segregated. My father's like one of the only black faculty members there. There are virtually no students. There's a huge blow up on the campus when a white student started dating a black football player. I mean, this was not a tolerant society. And they decided to get married. She said yes, and they decided to get married. And so, but they didn't tell anybody because they also knew that it would be rejected by everybody, not just, I mean, I don't think my father was worried so much about his family, but certainly my mother knew her parents were not going to approve of this. So they just went away and got married and then told their families that they got married. So my father's parents throw a party. My mother's mother disowns her. I mean, she doesn't really disown her, but she kind of does this is so terrible, we're gonna, and yeah, but they were already married. And my grandmother did everything in her power to try to get my mother out of it. Like, she started having other people call and tell my mother she'd made this horrible mistake, and yeah, so obviously my mother had already married him and had done it intentionally, knowing that this was going to be the reaction. And long story short, though, I didn't know this until later in life because my grandmother, my mother's mother, was my most active grandparent in my life. And because she only had to meet my father to flip. Now, that didn't mean she didn't have all her social issues back home. And she always came to us. At the time, I grew up in Washington, D.C., although I was born in Syracuse. They had moved to D.C. But the thing about that was so amazing was, one, the way my father handled it, which was just like, no big deal. And so as soon as he met my grandmother, she just loved him because he just embraced her and was himself, comfortable in his own skin, didn't feel like the need to be different from what he was. And she just recognized he really was the finest man my mother had ever met. And because as my mother told it, she just said, this is what my mother raised me to marry. This is the kind of person, the smart, professional, kind, They both came out of religious traditions that gave them same values base, you know. It's a fascinating story, but it was also so important because the way my parents managed it changed their relationship to my grandmother, which meant I grew up with one on my mother's side. But here's the other complicating factor. I remember when I never met my grandfather once. He came with her to visit. Now, he had been very sick, and so the explanation was always he could not travel. And he clearly was. He was wheelchair bound. He had heart condition, but he was a stranger. And I remember when he died, and I said to Mom, well, are we all going to the funeral? And my mother just looked at me and said, no, you're never going to Abilene. You're never going to Abilene. And I didn't go to Abilene, Texas till I was 30 years old, and my grandmother died. And I remember when my grandmother died, I just said, well, I'm coming now. And my mother said, that would be nice. And I think it was like she was done protecting me from the racism that was Abilene. But part of her protection was family had to come to us to visit us. We wouldn't go there to visit family.